We are very excited to introduce Maddie. If you don't know who Maddie is, Maddie Bright is the executive director at Earth Sangha, which has worked full-time on native plant conservation since 2011, and where she grew up as the daughter of the co-founders Lisa and Chris Bright. Maddie has worked closely with ecologists, botanists, and park managers all across Northern Virginia on plant conservation, ecological restoration over many years, including a brief stint interning at Huntley Meadows. Regularly teaches for both the Arlington Regional and Fairfax Master Naturalist chapters, and previously served on the steering committee for the National Capital Region Partnership for Invasive Species Management, our local PRISM group. So if you hear about Blue Ridge PRISM, we have a National Capital Region one too. Nature Florida is also a member. So looking forward to hear from Maddie. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. So we're going to talk a little bit about plant communities and plant selection today. So I'll talk a little bit about the sort of work we do at Earth Sangha, and then I'll kind of jump right in. For the purposes of tonight's class, I'm going to kind of skip over the kind of native plant 101, sort of why we want native plants, because I figure kind of singing to the choir with that point. Earth Sangha is a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based in Fairfax County. We were founded in 1997. It was actually my parents, Chris and Lisa, who founded it. I've been executive director now for 2 years. We are a sort of collaborative effort, if you will. So we work closely with volunteers, a few of whom are here today. Thank you so much. And we grow somewhere in the realm of about, or I should say distribute somewhere in the realm of 50,000 to 65,000 plants a year, about across 300-ish species or so. To put that number in perspective, there are about 1,200 vascular native plants to Fairfax County that are native to our region. So we're growing a pretty tidy little slice of it. We tend not to grow absolutely the most common sort of weedy annual sort of things. And some of the rare things we're not growing unless we have specific projects that they can go out to. We are on the cusp of a really exciting relocation and expansion effort. So we'll be moving from our Springfield home down to Lorton and growing from a kind of 1-acre container yard that you see there to a 10-acre sort of space that we'll be using. So it's very exciting, and we'll be sharing a lot more about that hopefully over this winter and next spring.
Do you make that accessible to nurseries or to the public, or what are we growing all those for?
We grow plants for the end consumer, both on the restoration side. So a lot of localities, other nonprofits, like the restoration work being done here at Nature Forward, has used our plants as well as homeowners. We do not supply to other nurseries, though. So this covers, this slide here covers a little bit of some of the background research about why native plants are really important to get back in. So this is a one sort of slide, condensed kind of native plant 101. And you can see that we, broadly speaking, need to conserve a lot of lands and waters that we're not doing right now. So to put in that kind of, the late great E.O. Wilson's half Earth sort of project, right? Setting aside half of the planet in some kind of conservation. Doug Tallamy's research that was actually done in suburban Maryland, looking at kind of 70% native plant biomass kind of being a tipping point for a wildlife model. In that case, it was a chickadee. And what we really see is that, if you're looking nationally, say, about how much land we have conserved, we're probably talking about 13%, depending on how you want to define conserved. Obviously, there are a lot of different sort of levels of protection. If we're looking locally in the DC area, a lot of our localities are sitting just under 10%. So our locality in Fairfax County is sitting just under 10%. Arlington County, which is a little bit more urbanized, is, I believe, closer to 8%. To put that 8% number in perspective, that's getting awful close to like how much parking lot space there is in Arlington County. So, we have a lot of sort of nasty land use decisions that are kind of baked in to our sort of conservation problems these days. There's a lot of interesting things that as we look at some of the emerging research, we see that we may not need to hit exactly that half Earth target if we're really clever about where we're doing that conservation. If we're connecting up habitat, we're going after high biodiversity sort of areas. One of the things that I think that if we look at that 50% number, and we think about what that really means, that really what we're doing is making the case that we need to be a lot more hands-on with our conservation and our restoration. I have a history degree by way of my background, and I feel this very strongly as it pertains especially to the mid-Atlantic. So again, a lot of my examples are going to be on the Virginia side of things. But archaeological records place humans in what is now Virginia somewhere between 15 and 14,000 years ago. That's getting you far enough back that we didn't really have a modern climate then. And I think that there's a real case to be made that the sort of coevolution that occurred between wildlife, much of the wildlife that we've now displaced or extirpated or has even gone extinct, and the plants that support that wildlife and human interaction was deeply co-evolved. And the human element is not simply that people are here, people had been here for a long time, but that our relationship to the land, our land management, and crucially our economic relationship, a much more extractive relationship to the land is relatively new. So we're talking about undoing the last few hundred years, or at least amending the last few hundred years of very highly extractive and negative sort of land management. But I think there's a case to be made that we need to be doing more things like burning, that we need to be filling in the gaps of predators that we have extirpated, like our mountain lion and our gray wolf, that we need to be thinking about a human-focused grassland management sort of program, because our grasslands would have been significantly more extensive throughout the mid-Atlantic, owing to the presence of a lot more fire and to bison and these large grazing animals that would have been in DC proper as late as the 1780s. We are deficient in a lot of wetlands too, owing to the loss of beaver. That's probably on the scale of several million beaver that we have lost across our region. So as we talk about the kind of tools that we want to use when we're kind of locked into, especially in our urban, suburban areas, a lot of fragmented habitat, and we are sort of, putting on ourselves some of the onus of doing this conservation and restoration. One of the best things that we can do is connect existing habitat. We can also reduce stressors on those habitats, create buffer sort of areas. This study, if you just Google Ellen Domshin 2019, it will pop up. It was published open access, so you can download the PDF, read through the entire thing. If you're not a big science nerd, just read the abstract and then skip to the discussion at the end. But it's a very, very interesting paper about sort of tenuously connected bits of the landscape. And really what they found is that even very tenuous, very narrow connections in the landscape can foster a great deal of resilience in the landscape post some kind of disturbance. So the more that we can connect up these habitats, the more that we're able to foster more biodiversity, more resilience, and that's going to become increasingly a necessary component of conservation as climate change tends to amp up a lot of the stressors that we're seeing in our natural areas. When we're looking at doing a lot of this conservation, I swear we'll get to the actual plant community component here shortly. But one of the things that we want to think about is how do we maximize diversity on site? And I think there are a lot of ways about answering that question. In its most simple definition, when you're thinking of biodiversity, you might be thinking of something like a Simpson's index, right? Which is simply what is the number of species on site, right? And you just give a count, and like that's true, that's great. But we may want to think about, say, how does the gradients across the site work? How does the habitat vary? What are the little micro sort of habitats we might have on site? If you're moving up and down slope, right, that's a gradient to consider, moving from a shady forest into a meadow, moving from wet areas to dry areas. And in a really healthy site, what you want to be seeing is a high degree of what ecologists call beta diversity. So beta diversity is the difference in the sort of species you have in one bit of habitat versus another across a site. So that would mean that your wet areas look substantially different from your dry areas, and your shady areas have different plants growing than in your sunny areas. If you have a low amount of beta diversity, then you have a lot of overlap between what's growing in those areas, and we see that in a lot of disturbed areas. So really, as we're thinking about replanting, thinking about the layout of the site, how can I fit in more biodiversity? What are these differences? What are these little niches that you can fill? Are a real tool to building out a more diverse and, again, more resilient landscape. So when we're thinking about what a plant community is, I think if you just think of it in a really sort of basic sense, it's how plants tend to order themselves in a certain environment in the wild, right? So what we're looking at is an assemblage of plants that are a sort of predictable way of growing together. And they say something about the landscape. I'm a big believer that in the restoration side, the closer that we can get to some kind of natural or successional plant community, one, I think the better result we get. But also, two, I think that it takes a little bit of the research onus off of us, right? So if we know that wildlife inhabits this kind of plant community, then we don't need to know every single little nuance in it. We can just try and recreate that plant community with as much fidelity as we're able to, and know that we're creating the kinds of habitat that appeal to these things. Almost every state, or I believe now every state, has a natural heritage program, though they may call it something different. You can click through to these links. I included both Virginia's and Maryland's there, and there is just a dizzying amount of data through there. I will say that most natural heritage programs don't capture a lot of our grassland plant communities. They historically viewed those as simply successional plant communities rather than sort of natural climax plant communities in their own right. I think a lot of the thinking on that is shifting. But for forested and wetland plant communities, these are absolutely sort of exhaustive tools. As we jump ahead, if we look at some of these things quantitatively, and the next slide here will contain some of the data that you can find through a natural heritage program, they're going to be looking at really two variables, and they're going to be doing that quantitatively. So one of them is constancy, and that's just a percentage. And it's what percentage of the test plots did a given species show up on. So if it's 100, it was in every single test plot. You will have a whole bunch that are very, very low that were just found here and there. And then cover is given in classes, but a higher number is a higher cover class. And a lower number is a smaller cover class. And that's simply, if you were to imagine an aerial view of every test plot, it's what percentage of the land was covered. The reason they group them into coverage classes rather than giving you that raw percentage is, I think, to help you not add those things up. Total cover will be well above 100% in any given one of these things because you're counting it for each species individually, right? So if you have, tree canopy, obviously you'll have, 100% cover, and then there'll be understory, right? Which will add up to some other amount, so on and so forth. And then we can just start to think about, in very basic terms, what we might be seeing the plants doing by looking at some of this data. And this to me is where, because I'm not a very quantitative person, where this gets really interesting, because you can start to kind of visualize the landscape just by looking at these sheets and kind of picking out, okay, the things that are high cover and high constancy are going to be really just all throughout the landscape, right? Everywhere you look, you will probably see one of these things, especially in a very healthy example. Your low cover, high constancy plants are going to be kind of scattered throughout, right? Whereas the inverse, right? Your sort of high cover, low constancy plants may be looking for a really specific kind of habitat or a specific niche. But when they find that, they may take over that whole space, right? So even just looking at some of these numbers, you can begin to really kind of piece together what a landscape might look at, especially if you're using, if you're looking at data from plant communities that are local to you, that you may be seeing in your parks, but not necessarily knowing the name to. So this is one of our most common plant communities, our forested plant communities throughout the Piedmont. This is a mesic mixed hardwood forest. Bradley, would you feel that, some of the area here represents a mixed hardwood forest? Yeah. So, a lot of our sort of rolling hills dominated by tulip tree and American beech are typified by that. You can see these are the highlighted species that are sort of diagnostic there. In some cases, very common species may not be something that really tells you too much. So in this case, because red maple is so common across so many plant communities, seeing more red maple doesn't necessarily tell you too much about what plant community you're in and of itself. But as you look through some of this, you can see some of these things pop out, right? So tulip tree and American beech are really ubiquitous. They're going to make up the bulk of the canopy. You can see that high cover class and that high constancy. You can see things like the Solomon seal with a relatively high constancy, but a pretty low cover class. And, if you think about how you see Solomon seal growing in the wild in most areas, it's a sort of scatter shot. You get little bits of it here and there, but it's relatively uncommon to find a dense grove of Solomon seal that carpets the floor. That's not something that you tend to see with that species. However, you may look at the New York fern, the Parathylipterus novaboracensis, it's over on the right, and notice that you have a substantially higher cover, but a much lower constancy. And indeed, when you see New York fern in a mixed hardwood forest, you're often getting it in swales and sort of lower points in the landscape, moving to the areas in between the kind of rolling hills in there where you start to get water collect. And indeed, it will form large rhizomatous colonies in there. So you can get really, really big, dense stands of it, but only when the hydrology really works out in these areas. So you can really begin to kind of suss out a little bit about the landscape. Again, this is not, I think, the most exciting component of what we'll talk about tonight, but I did wanted to throw this up there because if you start looking at the Natural Heritage Program, you can download all this data. It's all freely available. At least the Virginia stuff too, it's cross-tabbed by specific sites. So you can look at some of the variability that they saw across different test plots. The only change I made was to include the common names because I got tired of just saying them all out for everyone every time I showed this slide. So why are plant communities so important to us as we try and restore things? And so I think that looking at some of that data, and again, having a reference site, having another sort of healthy patch of forest, a good looking grassland, a healthy wetland to go into and understand what it looks like, tells us so much about what we ought to be doing on a restored space. It really does kind of guide us. What's great about the data that we're looking at is it's contemporaneous, that all that data is data that botanists and ecologists have collected recently. So we know that this is what other sites are looking like right now. I think it answers some questions about density and the relative proportion of things that we ought to be planting. I think if we look at a degraded site and start to think about, okay, what do we already have? What don't we need to plant? That's also an important question to answer, especially because doing restoration planting at scale is not a cheap endeavor and also requires a lot of effort. So if you already have a lot of tulip tree and American beech coming back up, just because a mixed hardwood forest is filled full of those things, I wouldn't spend any more, right? If you have really good regeneration of oaks and hickories, and we do see that sometimes on these degraded sites as you remove things, don't plant more of those things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. This is a little bit of research that I like to show folks. So actually, Bradley, you were apparently involved in collecting some of the data, right? So excellent. I include this in a lot of my slides. And the reason I think it's so fascinating is because I think it is one of the really bits of hard evidence we have to be optimistic about things. So I will deliver the caveat that my understanding is that there was little to no deer pressure, right, in New York City when this was collected, right? Sorry, no, as in there was deer pressure or there was? There was not deer pressure, thank you. So, again, we do have to be controlling the deer to see these results, but really what they looked at was if you go in and control these sort of primary target sites, or control a set of primary target invasive species, They did not do replanting, was my understanding. And then they go back and they revisit them afterwards, compared to the controls that didn't have anything done to them. What you find is that your native cover changes substantially in a positive way. It about doubles is what the data there were showing. And you saw a reduction in total non-native invasive cover, including in some cases non-target species. So there's a lot to be said for, I think, going in and doing very intensive, very hands-on restoration work. But I think the flip side is that if we set ourselves up for success, and part of that is having deer management approaches, right? And that can be, exclusion, right? It doesn't need to be deer culls, though I think in some cases that really needs to be on the table. But if we can set the scene for success, even a sort of one-off or a limited kind of scope of work can really set these things on very different trajectories. And I think that's really important to remember, that we can make a long-term impact. And these sites, are also something, and we see this on restoration in our region too, that people will come back and continue to kind of carry those sites forward and bring them forward. We really do have to be thinking on a long time scale, for these changes to take effect. If we're going to ameliorate a few hundred years of really poor land management, we need to be thinking a few hundred years out, So I am an inherently impatient person, so I get it. I want to see the results right now. But if we keep doing this collectively, we will make a difference.
So I'm trying to make sure. This project's the whole thing on like the Johnson Handle 2016 is very interesting. It's all connected to a restoration project that occurred in the 90s, and then going back like 20 years later to see the results of it. So it was a removal of primary target species, primarily non-native invasive vines, as well as Norway maple. And then they did do some replanting, only of primarily fast-growing trees were replanted, but they were still seeing an incidence of recovery of the other species that were planted as well. But it was pretty crazy to go into the sites that they decided to leave it alone back in the 90s, and sites that they did do restoration, and it's just drastically different. One of the things that they were trying, one of the primary goals of this project was to reestablish canopies, because the vines had completely removed and created these gigantic canopy gaps. And it was very successful. That was like big check mark on success. And they did it once, and then they never went back to do more management. It was still showing a big benefit. Mm-hmm. And yes, this was in New York City, so no deer. All four boroughs except Staten Island.
On that slide,
I think we had another. Oh, yep.
Well, actually, maybe I don't know either of you. Why is there such a big increase in the potential invasive groups in both the ground layer and the woody understory?
My understanding is, well, one is that these were sites that were obviously just growing for 20 years. So you have a change in the plant community. My understanding, it's been a while, but I went to a presentation about this, and my understanding too is that there's obviously new invasion that has occurred in the intervening 20-year period. So there are new taxa that literally were not present in New York City that are making their way through, that would fit into those categories, and those are obviously included in there.
Where was this in New York City? Like, was this in the park, Central Park, Prospect Park, or what are you talking about?
I gotcha. Prospect Park. So Brooklyn was Prospect Park, Queens was Cunningham Park, in the Bronx, Pelham Bay and Van Cortlandt Park, and then in Manhattan it was Inwood Hill Park, right in the northern tip of Manhattan, not Central Park. But those are the main parks that were focused on during the study.
Anyway, to clarify, the point is not specifically what's happening in New York City parks. I don't know New York City parks that well, but that you can change the trajectory of a badly invaded park with essentially a one-time intervention. So the kind of restoration approaches that you may be looking at, and I'll define some of these terms in the following slides here, I think is going to vary a lot depending on the sort of site that you're working on, how many resources you can bring to bear. And that's not just financial resources, things as difficult as just how do we get the plants into this site? So like this was a planting that we did at Lake Fairfax Park with a team at Fairfax County Park Authority. This was actually a really hard site to get into. There was a bit of a steep slope. It was not well marked to get into the trails there. They had to bring some 4x4s to bring all the equipment in. Volunteers got lost coming and going. So, it was a little bit of an annoying kind of site to tackle, but all of those kind of logistical elements just add up to, wow, we probably don't want to revisit that, or we're just going to have to limit the amount of plants we're bringing in because each of those trays is pretty heavy and you can only hand carry so many trays in before everybody is too tired to dig holes after having done all that prep. There are areas, especially in meadow restoration, where they may be depending entirely on seed. Part of that is simply a scale issue. So if you look at our little tiny 1 acre nursery, we're supplying a good amount of plants every single year out of that. But if we're working with localities that may be seeding 5, 10 acres at a time, there simply isn't the availability of local seed, much less local plants, that can fill in that gap on that order. So they're going with larger suppliers like Earth Seed, which is based in Pennsylvania, and things like that, because the material simply doesn't exist. And then, you have more traditional kind of styles of, okay, we're reforesting an area. You see this a little bit more in what I would kind of term afforestation rather than reforestation, sort of the creation of kind of new forests, where they're just kind of putting in trees and they want them every 18 inches and they have a ton of whips and things going in. That can be a very intensive process. Over time, those results can be nice too, but I think it gives a very eerie sort of feeling in the meantime, and it doesn't give a lot of kind of structural diversity. Some research, and oh good, I did cite the paper on this, has found that seed-based restoration, and again, this is looking at all the stock in this study was local, but they planted out sort of test plots and left them for a number of years. And then they also had reference plots that they're looking at, both post-agricultural and sort of remnant meadows. And what they found is that in general, using both seedlings, that is potted plants, and seeds was a more durable intervention than seeds alone. It's not entirely clear why that is. The discussion section of this paper goes on for some time, kind of trying to figure out why that may be the case. But that's also been something that we've seen in the field kind of happening over and over again, that sometimes these seed-based things are not as durable, at least in terms of outside of a controlled study. Usually when you're seeing a seed-only based replanting, you are very rarely seeing a whole lot of local ecotype stock. So there may be a certain amount of stressor on the landscape there. In some cases too, you see some weird behavior with the mix themselves. So if things were specced improperly, or just because of the sort of year effect that you get on the site, that is, maybe you get a really dry year or a really wet year that first year you're germinating, it may force up a whole bunch of one thing that is then not very happy the following year. That dies back and that leaves a lot of gaps. So you have something that's not a very resilient intervention. Again, when you're doing that kind of seed-based restoration across a large area, you're typically not exploiting a lot of microhabitats across the site. So you may be trying to ameliorate that by including a lot of different species in your mix. So there's some things that like it more wet, and you're just kind of consigning those to not germinate in drier areas, or vice versa. So there are ways to play around with it. It's not something we do a lot of ourselves, though we have supplied seed to a few smaller scale sort of projects. This is from a paper describing how applied nucleation works. I apologize, I don't think I included a citation. I think that's a Corbin study. I can certainly find that and send that along to folks. But what the diagram is sort of describing is, along with the drawings, which I think are really kind of, again, for someone like me who's not very quantitative, really illustrative of, is the kind of good quality natural regeneration that you might see on a site. And then a sort of applied nucleation where you're going in and planting pockets of a site. Oftentimes you're doing that quite densely. And then a sort of more plantation style where you're planting an entire site. Obviously, the plantation style sort of replanting represents a very high cost sort of method, both in terms of the materials and in terms of the labor going in. And what you can see is that you tend to get a site that is one kind of age class with everything kind of coming up at once. It can be very hard to establish an understory layer at the same time as you're doing those things. You also, I think, really open yourself up to a little bit more risk as you do this. So I mentioned the term year effect before. That is simply when you have a weird thing that happens in the year that you're getting something established that then sets your restoration or your site on a different trajectory long term. So it could be as simple as you plant out an area, you have a very, very bad drought. In most restoration sites, no one's watering anything ever. So it kills your most drought sensitive species. And then 2 or 3 years later, you have a year of sort of constant rain. And all those plants that would have thrived in that kind of wet year are simply not on the site because they died when they were very young and very vulnerable. And then you may lose some other of your plants that like it a little bit more well-drained. Suddenly you're losing a large amount of diversity on site, and you've made that site a lot more vulnerable to invasion simply by having a lot of open area and open niches that are sort of unfilled. One of the things you can do is have a difference in age classes, and applied nucleation is a way to do that without necessarily phasing in your plantings, because you will have sort of seed set and spread from your planting areas. Sometimes this is combined with a much looser plantation strategy or a seed-based strategy outside of the nuclei. You may want to phase things in too over time and do replanting over, say, 2 or even 3 years, again, to avoid those year effects. And in some cases, you may not want to plant at all. You may have very high quality regeneration, and you may just want to leave a site alone. So when we're talking about the kinds of plant selection that we're looking at, I'm a big believer that you want to get fairly common plants back out onto the site. That doesn't mean the absolute most common things. So, you know, for instance, we grow a lot of Eupatorium species, but we don't grow any Eupatorium serotinum. I don't think there's any good reason to put Eupatorium serotinum, that is late bone set, our most common bone set, back into any restored area. It pops up on its own all the time. It's very aggressive. It seems to do just fine finding these sites over and over again. But as you kind of move into the kind of, I think I like to think of it as sort of the middle of the bell curve there, your species that are common enough that things depend on them, and that there are a lot of right places for these plants, you find that you have a lot of wildlife interactions that are really, really important with these species. And so a lot of these are things that ecologists like Doug Tallamy have phrased kind of keystone sort of species. Now, I like to mention this because, of course, we're all interested in rare plant conservation and in rare plant community conservation. But again, what we see, if we want to get rare plants back into a site, so this is part of Elk Lick in the western part of Fairfax County. We're in the Triassic Basin area now. And the kind of blurry, sorry, excuse me for the cell phone photo, but the kind of blurry thing that I ran a whole bunch of text over top is a state rare purple milkweed, Asclepias purpurascens, the same as my title slide. What we find is that in most of our rare plant communities, and indeed where most of our rare plants themselves are growing, they are surrounded by habitat that is dominated by much more common plant species. And those common plant species are making the habitat that allows them to thrive. So bringing out these rare plants kind of early on onto a new restoration site can be fraught with a lot of difficulty. It's not just the exposure to a lot of sun or a lot of wind. There's soil compaction. There could simply not be the mycorrhizal components in the soil yet that they need to thrive, and they need these other plant, the rest of the plant community to be there before they get into that area. You can think of them as sort of more a passenger species rather than a driver, if you will. So if we're looking at the kinds of wildlife that our wildlife, or the kinds of plants that our wildlife is depending on, what you find is that our most common plant species, or our decently common sort of plant genera, are doing a lot of the heavy lifts. So you find that a lot of our common aster species, things like solidago, that is our goldenrods, our sunflowers, our asters, are supporting the most specialist bees. So this is research, again, that was done in Maryland by Sam Droege and Jared Fowler, looking at allegelectic bees. So those are bees that are mostly pollen eaters, and they're specializing in eating the pollen of a few things. They tend to be heavily specialized on asters. Part of that is because aster pollen, unlike, say, mint pollen, tends to be toxic. So the plants actually don't want too many things eating their pollen, right? Because if that happens, then they can't reproduce, right? So asters tend to pack away a little, some kind of chemical mix in their pollen that makes them unpalatable to generalist pollen-eating bees, which tend to go eat other things. So you do see a lot of specialization in those asters, but all of those the genera that I mentioned there are things that we see pretty much across any decent quality meadow. If you're walking through a meadow and you don't see a goldenrod, I'm kind of questioning if you're seeing anything alive at all in there. It's not really a meadow yet. And similarly, when we talk about our Lepidoptera, our moths and caterpillars, they're often depending on some of our most common canopy tree species, things like our oaks, willows, black cherry, to a lesser degree, our hickories. These are also species that are crucially important for small mammals and for birds. They produce a lot of mast. These are kind of the basics of a lot of our plant communities, and you can see that they have those interactions to kind of back them up.
When you're redoing an area, when you like Fairfax County around, are you redoing the soil also, or are you letting it grow the way the soil is? Isn't that how the native plants should grow? The way the soil is, the natural soil is, or are you refurbishing the soil?
So I would say typically in restoration, it's rare to be doing anything to the soil. I think that it's an open question whether the soil structures and things that we have now are indicative of what historical structures look like. Almost certainly, extensive agricultural use and really poor quality agriculture post the initial European settlement in our area caused a lot of soil loss. The things that they were doing, if you look at early English language manuals aimed at colonists and settlers, telling them what to do, it was things like plow up all the soil, dump saltpeter on it, just real craziness, right? We know from written accounts that they were favoring areas based on the richness of their plant communities to clear, to use as farmland. So we lost areas that had richer, deeper soil first. And they probably allowed a lot of that to erode away because they weren't practicing agricultural techniques like we would today. And indeed, they didn't recognize in a lot of cases, even the English explorers. I'm sorry for the discursion, but I have a history degree, so this is fascinating to me. But even the English explorers and colonists who were interested in getting to know what indigenous people were doing here did not have a keen enough eye to understand the sort of agroforestry practices that indigenous Americans were practicing. So for instance, if you read John Bannister's account of his travels in and around the James River, so think about, where Richmond is currently, he's writing in the middle of the 17th century, I believe. And so he talks about, for instance, how fascinating he found it that our native grapevines here, without any tending at all, grew laterally across shrubs, so you could easily harvest them. Whereas European grapevines, if you did nothing, would grow into trees. But he just didn't have that little spark of creativity to be like, no, of course they're pruning the grapes back. That's why they're in reach, But he didn't see it right in front of him. And so he just assumed that's how they grew. So there was obviously by the time the Europeans arrived, there was a lot of agriculture taking place. Squash, beans, corn, all of those were introduced crops that had been domesticated thousands of years ago that were being grown extensively through the area. But there was a lot of agroforestry happening too. So chestnut was a very important species. Chestnut yielded seeds every single year, which made it that much more important. And it can be eaten with relatively little preparation. The predominant cooking oil in our region would have been acorn oil. So they would have lye treated that and pressed it. That would have been an effective way of kind of extracting calories out of oak canopy, as well as supporting the sort of game that they would have been taking. Hickory was used as a nut milk. Indeed, he recounts that in an early term that they used when they were trading for European cow's milk, which they loved, was hickory, because that was the word both for the tree, the nut, and the resulting milk. So there's a lot of interesting things that we find in the historical record. We think of hazelnuts as like a nice little treat. He tried to trade for some, and they were shocked that he would want them because they didn't regard it as edible. And they basically told him, if you want hazelnuts, go in the woods and pick your hazelnuts, but that's gross. We don't have any of those. So anyway, that's my segue back into the importance of understory shrubs. I was talking with Alan as we both arrived about Viburnum acerifolium, and there's a photo of our maple leaf viburnum there. This is a hard plant to find. It's increasingly hard to find in the wild. You'll find if you want to buy one, it's hard to source as well. We are perennially sold out. Sorry, we're growing as many as we can, but people love this plant. What you do, if you look at some of the research about what's really important about our understory shrubs in general, but viburnum in particular, what you see is that one is that a lot of our migratory birds, especially our songbirds, want to nest in that kind of 5 to 10, 15, 20 feet off the ground. So again, if we just look at those keystone species in the last slide, we're not really talking about a lot of understory trees and shrubs. So this is a really important element just for the structure of the habitat. What this study that was done in 2017 in Pennsylvania found was that simply the amount of viburnum, in this case, they were looking at the more common viburnum dentatum, the arrowwood viburnum, simply the amount of viburnum in a forest was a really good indicator, looking at a few dozen species of migratory bird, about whether those birds were gaining mass or losing mass as they were migrating south. And you would expect them to still be putting on mass as they go and move south from Pennsylvania. But the loss of their viburnum dentatum, largely due to the invasive viburnum leaf miner beetle, found that a lot of these birds were falling out of good migratory health. And we're probably going to struggle to survive the winter or to complete a successful migration. So getting these things back in the landscape, very important. Sorry, I realize we have a question here.
Hi, just a quick question. I did my botany 50 years ago in New Jersey, where viburnum dentatum was very common and I studied woodlands. I'm not aware of it being very common here. Is there a historical record?
Oh, yes.
Of viburnum dentatum, acerifolium, excuse me, acerifolium.
Yes, at least on the Virginia side of things, we see viburnum acerifolium with some degree of frequency. We tend to get it in the more kind of drier areas of our forests as you get up to the top of balds and things like that. Again, I think we're seeing its decline at least in the areas that I'm familiar with. One, because the deer do really, really like the viburnums in general as food. Two, there's a tendency for some of our more upland species, because they're a little bit more taxed, they're a little bit more water stress in those environments. They're in general not sequestering as many chemical defenses as their more lowland counterparts are. So I think the deer tend to hit these ones before they go after Viburnum dentatum. And then I really think that the rainfall patterns that we've been having over the last few decades, where we're having bigger events, but then spacing in between, have made our populations really kind of a lot more delicate and less resilient. But we should be seeing them in areas where, in Virginia, where deer overabundance is less of an issue. You still see good healthy stands, but generally kind of more dry mesic to even xeric forests is where we're seeing them.
What about non-native viburnums being spread?
Yeah, we see a ton of non-native viburnums. Again, most of the wildlife is not making use of them. Some of them are very easy to pick out because of their bright red fruit. We don't have any of our native ones that produce a bright red fruit. I'm at least seeing them mostly proliferating right in stream valleys and more moist areas. So they're competing up against Viburnum dentatum. In my experience, what I've been seeing is that the deer are preferentially browsing the Viburnum dentatum. So you tend to get these really big, quick growing non-native viburnum that are displacing our native ones. And it can be tricky because they do look pretty similar, especially when they're not in fruit. So for a lot of volunteer-led invasive removals, it can be tricky to go in there and really see that kind of nuance, especially if you're not there in the right season. At least when we're working with volunteers, we try and bring them out at the right time of the year, that you can see the worst offenders that are producing fruit and remove those. But especially like the little seedlings, if you're not familiar with just seeing a lot of seedling Viburnum dentatum over and over and over again, it can be really hard to determine if you're seeing some of the native ones come back or some of the non-native ones. I'm not going to read off this whole slide, this whole quote there. It's a rather lengthy thing, but I figured Doug Tallamy is best served in kind of having just his words put there. To summarize quickly, what they found is that as you start to look at a local population level, a sort of ecotype level, if you will, with these relationships between host plants and the insects that they support, is you find that even generalist species, things like the Luna moth, which has been recorded eating dozens of different native trees and shrubs, are really specializing in maybe 1, 2, or 3 actual hosts on any given population level. That complicates things in a couple ways. One is that that's not simply caterpillar preference. That is also, a strategy, an evolutionary strategy of the plants to defend themselves against herbivory. It's not just the insects that are the active players. The plants' underlying genetics play a role here. So what that really means is that there is a good reason to think that moving our plants around a lot may be interrupting some of these herbivory things. That's not to say that if you got a sweet gum tree that was grown in Tennessee, it's totally worthless, throw it out. But that the farther afield that we're moving these things, we may be interrupting the wildlife interactions that it has. And we don't really know it. There's not a lot of research done at this level about what those interactions are like. But if you find papers that do that, you find that over and over again, that there are these sort of shifts. In some cases, it can be relatively rapid. In some cases, it's across large swaths of a species habitat. Again, this is a paper, we don't need to delve into the great details of this, but this was looking at the ecotype level differences in populations of a dominant grass species, in this case, big blue stem, which is not a major constituent out here, but is a major constituent of tall grass prairie systems. So every one of those colors in the sort of pie graphs and those vertical, the histogram there is really reporting the same data just in a different way, is a unique ecotype. And because big bluestem is dominant on site and it's wind pollinated, the thinking was that big bluestem would probably have more or less be kind of genetically homogeneous across large swaths, that you wouldn't have a lot of these sort of little ecotypes across the same site, or even across a large region. That was the prevailing thought for a long time. And what they found was that actually on any given site, you would have multiple ecotypes of this species represented in just one prairie fragment. In some cases, I know it's really hard to see with the ones on the right that are both pale green and pale blue, but there are a few of those that are almost evenly divided. So the one in the lower right is about even between the pale blue and the pale green, suggesting two ecotypes in relative kind of co-dominance across one site. In other ones, you may have an ecotype that's dominant, but then have a lot of diversity in the sort of minority of those species. I think it stands to reason then that insect pollinated species that are going after smaller niches, may be having a good deal of genetic diversity that needs to be protected. Yep.
So my question is, these states are pretty big compared to Maryland. I'm wondering if there's a certain limit in terms of wind pollination that they can actually mix in, and otherwise, I mean, in Maryland, you probably would see things that are more the same because the state's smaller. Just wondering about distance.
I'm not entirely sure. A few of these were quite close together, and you can see pretty big shifts there. So you can see that cluster in northeastern Kansas where you have a dominant one ecotype that's dominant, and then another site, one that's hardly present at the other site is dominant. Some of these pollen grains can spread pretty far. It stands to reason that fragmented habitats would vary from one spot to another, even if they're connected by pollination. They're likely not connected by seed set anymore. But I think what's most interesting to me from a conservation standpoint is that in any given site, we're seeing a lot of genetic diversity that remains, that it's not, oh, well, on one site, it's pretty much all the same thing. We're not seeing a ton of homogeneity there. On some sites we're close, but on other sites we're not. And again, this is looking at a model species where the assumption was that you would have a great deal of genetic similarity across a single site. So the reason I include it is because we may still be sitting on a great reservoir of genetic diversity, even on any given little tiny site. And so there's a lot of value in protecting all of these little refugia that collectively make up our diverse sort of flora. And again, reconnecting those things so they can be more diverse.
I know Lauren has another question too. I'll say, even with Maryland being a small state, another thing to consider would be not just size of the state, but geographic barriers. Think mountains, think the Chesapeake Bay, and how difficult it is to have genetics move across those. And now Lauren has a question.
Well, I'm just going to comment that I think all of this, gets at the realization that we actually don't really know what's going on. Because I mean, that's how I look at this. I figure I'm going to try to collect as locally as I can, because we really don't know that much about the deeper questions about, like, well, maybe there's genetic incompatibilities. Maybe there are things that prevent cross-pollination between the two populations that we don't even know anything about, because realistically, we haven't studied these species that deeply the way that we study a lot of agricultural species and know a lot more about how they pollinate, or whether they're self-incompatible, or all the kinds of things that go on that are quite complex. So I think that your point is exactly perfect, that basically every little patch counts, right?
And I will throw two more wrinkles into the mix. And so One is that I think you're absolutely right, that we just don't know. There's not enough research. And so if we do a little bit of a callback to that Ellen Domshin study and you read that discussion, she talks about this. She says, we don't understand all the mechanisms at work about why habitat connectivity pays off the way it does. This is, ecology is inherently really, really complex. And the point she makes is that we can't wait to have it all figured out. We have to keep moving. So really conservation is a moving target and we have to move along with it. We can't wait for all the science, that's not even how science works, to be in. We have to be doing conservation and restoration. And I think that anyone who's been in this kind of work for a while, I'm only 36, but I have enough projects under my belt that I can look back and say, I would not have done it that way. I would now, knowing what I do now, I would change things. And I think that's the reality of our sort of work. The other sort of thing that I will add in terms of this is not meant to be specifically a talk about how we shouldn't be moving plants around at all. There's also good evidence that we're working with plant populations that are in inbreeding depressions and really need that connectivity spread back up. So in some cases, our specialist milkweeds, which really are most fecund after disturbance, are probably both geographically fragmented and temporally fragmented. So that is when they're doing most of the flowering in any given patch, if nobody is burning or mowing all together, only a small handful of that population is ready to cross-pollinate and set seed at any given time. There's a really good podcast on Asclepias conservation out in tallgrass prairie states that's on the Indefensive Plants podcast. And they talk about a program where they're actually burning a state rare milkweed, and they've gotten all of these private property owners across the state to collaborate, and they burn it at the exact same time. They just go out and torch the small patches, and they're seeing a big explosion in these milkweed stands simply by connecting up the pollination ecology. I was reading a paper recently that Lobelia cardinalis may be significantly inbred in some areas because hummingbird migration is tricky and they're not the most reliable pollinators, and there's really nothing else that's pollinating Lobelia cardinalis. They think that there's maybe a lot of self-pollination going on, or there are other things pollinating it that are as yet unstudied. So again, we just don't know, and Lobelia cardinalis has been in the trade for a while too. So to have big question marks about what is pollinating this is just, it's really interesting what we don't know.
Sorry, real quick, we do have a question in the chat from Nikki. What are nurseries and seed providers doing, or what can they do to promote genetic differences within the materials provided for restorative projects?
So I think that's a great point. So I had a conversation with some of the folks at Ernst Seed, as well as Bert Harris at the Clifton Institute that's down in Fauquier County in Virginia. They're looking at trying to get a seed sort of industry started in Virginia for restoration purposes. So for a lot of those seeds that are labeled as having a specific ecotype, so they say Virginia Piedmont or whatever, they're trying to go back out to sites the same way we do at Earth Sangha and collect seed every single year. So you're getting back out to those wild reservoirs and interacting with those sorts of things. I think that asking plant suppliers of provenance is important in understanding where your plants come from. So the more people ask, the more that would hopefully come up. I'm a big believer in using seed-based sort of things at our nursery. That's not to say that we don't take cuttings. We do have species that we take cuttings of. And especially when we have really crowded pots, we are dividing things. So there is some clonal technique taking place there. But we like to work with seed every time we can because we know we're getting a genetically unique individual. I will say for our work, we do not micro lot. So that is to say, for any given species, we're collecting across Fairfax County, and effectively all of that seed is going together. So we keep track of our different collection sites where we're working with species that are common across the county. We do try and go to different sites, so we're collecting hopefully a decent amount of genetic diversity on those sites. But we're not separating those things out. So we won't say specifically because we don't know, if that Solidago rugosa is a coastal plain ecotype or a Piedmont ecotype. In the conversations we've had with the ecologists who use our plants, they don't care. They just want the plants and they know that they're from around here. So, depending on the sort of project, you may want to be very, very narrowly defined. I know that we've supplied to and worked with folks who are doing projects that are so narrowly defined that they're only looking at growing plants from that specific site. I don't know about that, but I know that it's really up to the land manager. So this is a little bit of research that Annie White presented a number of years ago at the Lahr Symposium. I thought it was a really interesting talk that she gave. She has a nursery background as well. And this was done up in Vermont. And what they're looking at is common cultivars of native plants and their wild type and looking at pollination visitation. What they find is that in the vast majority of cases that she looked at, the wild type, that's the lighter gray, was more attractive to a number of different pollinators. That is, all insect pollinators, all bees, and all native bees are the way that those paired bars are broken down. In some cases, you'll see that the specific cultivar she was looking at and the wild type were about even. So Rudbeckia fulgida gold sturm and the wild type Rudbeckia fulgida performed pretty equally, at least in this kind of testing. And indeed, in some cases, you might be hard pressed to tell some of those cultivars just from their flower apart. In one case, the cultivar outperformed, so that's the Veronicastra virginicum lavendelterm. That was specifically bred to attract more insects to it. So they introduced a lot of blue and purple into it. Again, from an ecology standpoint, I do question a little bit the use of that. Is it drawing things from other plants that would be better off getting that pollination? I don't know. Anytime you deviate, it's really hard to tell. An assertion that is made in this study that I'm not sure that I pull quoted was looking at insect herbivory. And so in some of these cases where leaf color changed dramatically, so you had these kind of permanent red or purple leaves, most of the chemicals that give leaves those colors are toxic. That's the reason why the plant evolved to produce them, not so people would think that they look nice. And what they found is that, oh yeah, the amount of insect herbivory on a permanently red or purple leaf is much, much lower than one that's green. But they looked at variegated leaves that have pale or even white sections, and they found that insect herbivory actually increased a little bit. But the takeaway is not to plant more variegated plants. I will say, they mentioned this in the paper, but you got to keep reading to learn the fact. Within the chloroplast, which is where the green element is, there is an enzyme 1,6-ribulose bisphosphate, rubisco, it's called for short. That is the most common enzyme on the planet. And in most plant leaves, it makes up about 2/3 of all the protein in the leaf material. So the insects were eating more leaf material in the variegated leaves because there was no protein in the leaves for them. They needed to eat more to continue to grow. So again, these really kind of nuanced sort of components there, have to be sort of considered. So I sort of argue, as we deviate more and more, on an ecological level, is that something we want to be doing? I think not. Okay, we have yet another study. I think this one's really fascinating. I love this researcher. This is Anna Bukharova up in Germany, looking at a common aster. It's a type of knapweed that's grown in a lot of meadows there. They collected them from a single region and then grew them out in a whole bunch of different regions across the country. So they had what is a local ecotype, and then they grew it elsewhere where it's not local to. And what they found is as you get farther and farther afield from its home territory, you get a lot less of a specialist seed herbivore coming to those seed heads. So it's this little tiny thing that likes to eat the seeds as they're developing. You saw a big decrease, about 1/4 as many in the farthest plots from where they collected. And we're talking across the country, so this is a big distance. But they were also looking at an insect predator that is only eating, it's a parasitoid, only eating that little thing that eats the seeds of this thing. So another specialist relationship, one trophic level up, if you will. And they found that that had a 9-fold decrease. So what we're seeing is that as you pull plants out of their sort of co-evolved relationships on those very local scales, that you can be magnifying the sort of loss that you have. So that is to say that it doesn't get better as you move up a trophic level. It might get worse in some cases, especially with these sort of specialist interactions. For the sake of time, I'm going to buzz by that, but the whole takeaway is it is yet more evidence that suggests as we move native plants around, we are seeing less wildlife interaction the farther we move them away. A big shout out to doing restoration in places that are not good for human use. So the area on the left in Dyke Marsh was just really heavily invaded. It's not used for recreation. It's a long haul road, so it's very, very nice. We found that even, after removing invasives, most of what's emerging there, certainly the pokeweed by Ned, but the blue mistflower in front of him, the Smolanthus ovidalius that's towering over him, and not seen in the photo, but behind him is a whole lot of Passiflora lutea, our yellow passion flower. All of that came out of the seed bank. It was just waiting to be released. And this site was like 100% invasive plant covered before. This slope in Windmill Hill Park, one, it needs to stay there because that is a historic tunnel right next to it. It was badly invaded with ailanthus and mulberry, and they didn't want to mow it because that is impossibly steep. And that is a serious risk to health and safety to have people mowing that. So we planted a meadow so it wouldn't get reinvaded, as well as a lot of sumacs. If you go back to Windmill Hill Park today, it's just a wall of sumac, which is what the intention was, just to lock it back up in something native. There are a lot of interesting birds hanging out in that area. And then another area that we see, and again, I'm trying to speed through these things, we see really, really good, this is back at Elklick again, really, really good diversity and fecundity, so a lot of seed set happening in ecotones in transition areas from one plant community to another. These are very, very important areas to get back into and restore, in part because our typical way of managing ecotones is god awful. This is outside an elementary school where they had actually replanted with a whole bunch of our plants, and then the custodial staff mowed over it. I'm not mad at the custodial staff. They have a lot on their plates. But this is indicative about how our urban suburban landscapes look. You have some built element, you have something that is obliterated on a regular basis because it needs to be neat and tidy, and then you just have like this wall. There's no transition. There's just an abrupt transition to canopy. There's no shrub layer, there's no herbaceous layer. That ecotone is effectively gone. And so reestablishing that, even just getting like 3, 4, 5, 6 more feet adds so much diversity and so much resiliency back into those spaces. At home, there's my baby. She was like 1 in that, she's 3 now. But this is our backyard. And again, we can think of our backyards like an ecotone. So we have, if you were to look kind of farther to the right, that's all tulip tree. We actually thinned our stand of tulip trees. It's really expensive to do that. But it allowed us to plant more oaks and hickories that are coming back up to get a more diverse canopy long term. Also because a few of those tulip trees were going to land on the house, and I'm awfully fond of having a roof. And then we have this nice shrub layer of Euonymus americanus, of elderberry, we have viburnums, we have hazelnut. And then the front yard is really all meadow sort of species. So you can have that transition from sun to shade. And I think that lines up really well with a typical suburban sort of yard. Again, you can manicure it as you see fit. Ours is pretty wild. We don't have an HOA, so nobody can do anything about it.
We were traveling all over Europe, and we did not find any bare ground anyway, like you showed on the site of the school. Just about everywhere they're leaving wild growth for nature. It was so heartwarming.
Yeah.
So when I came back to America, I saw all this land has been mowed away, that could be useful to the, for the birds and the insects.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and it ties back into what we were talking about before I came up. The problem isn't people. It's not population. It's not population density. It's not who lives here. It is our relationship to the landscape, which is badly deformed. And advocacy is such a powerful tool for changing how we do those things, because in a lot of cases, there are legal impediments to that. So VDOT wanted some sightline, even though this little tiny path doesn't allow motorized vehicles. It was within a right of way. There are all these legal hurdles to just having some asters growing on a verge, right? So as we make those things easier to do, again, through that advocacy component, we can make conservation happen. I talked a little bit about the difficulties of rare plant reintroduction and reliance on it, so I won't repeat that, other than just to brag that we have grown Pycnanthemum torii, and we have grown Solidago rigida. That's my mom there. Those are rare plants. Pycnanthemum torii is globally rare. So it's just been really cool to be able to handle those sorts of species. Again, another area, this was used as overflow parking for that already had parking set aside for like a little ball court. This is is adjacent to a clover leaf for 495. It's a small park called Americana Park. We work with Department of Public Works and Dominion Power to replant it. That meadow's still there. It looks really, really good. And this was like a gravel pit when we started. They brought a guy out to disc it up because it was just couldn't even sink a shovel in. They put down some seed, we replanted. Again, this was land that was not really being used 99% of the time. Kids are still playing ball in the field right next to it. There's plenty of parking, and now they have something nice to look at rather than a horrible pit. Yeah. Okay, so I did finish up. I'm happy to answer more questions, at least until Bradley tells me to leave. So thank you, everybody.
All right. We are always very appreciative of Maddie's wide breadth of knowledge, even if it goes over time a little bit. So I feel like we could do a little bit of questions, It is a little after 7, but typically our presentations do run until 8 when they start at our normal time. I just a couple of additions just about like particularly the viburnum conversation that was being had here. Just by removal of deer, we've seen arrowwood viburnum dentatum coming up naturally quite frequently in one particular forest area, which is nice. Blackclaw viburnum prunifolium, very deer resistant. Is what we still had mature individuals here despite deer. Acerifolium, no, none. Yeah. It also has a really strong acidic component to it too. Really, you do find it associated in a lot of our heath-dominated forests, and one of the attributes of urban areas is a lower incidence of acidity in our soils, especially tied to past agricultural use. So that's another layer of why we're seeing less of some of our really more uncommon species, I guess. So
this hedge right outside here, it's this beautiful golden.
Yeah.
It looks like a viburnum. What is it?
That's Fothergilla gardini. Oh, okay. So it's the Fothergilla, its closest native state would be North Carolina. So like I said, for the gardens, we use kind of more of a broader definition for planting.
I have a question about hybrids. What about naturally occurring hybrids? Do you do anything with those?
Yeah, so we do handle some naturally occurring hybrids. We have grown acorns collected off of hybrid oaks. Most oak hybrids are not stable, so they're reverting back to one or the other parent species. We have grown on I think only once, from a wild stand of Lobelia speciosa, which is a very rarely occurring hybrid, really mostly from the southeast. So we're kind of on the edge of where you tend to see it, of Lobelia cardinalis and Lobelia syphilitica. It tends not to stick around very much. I will say that I'm not hugely opposed to these sort of naturally occurring hybrids. I will say that in a lot of areas, I think it is a consequence of fragmentation, though, that because you don't have large enough stands of either of the parent which would preferentially pollinate, you tend to get some of those hybrids forming because they're fragmentary and there's, more likely to be cross-pollinated by this a closely related species.
Can you tell us what is your latest project right now?
It's all nursery expansion right now, everything, all hands on deck. That's all we're thinking about. So
I, through Friends of Sligo Creek, work with Pepco in a stretch of about 20 acres of power line. And occasionally it's winter only mowing every 3 years, February or so. Very successful so far. They occasionally they offer to provide us with seed if we want to do some seeding from Ernst. Given the kind of ecotypes that Ernst provides, and I think the meadow mix is from like northwestern Pennsylvania or something like that, would we be better off sticking with the seed bank? We have 120 native species have shown up. Better off sticking with the seed bank and saying no thanks to Ernst, or saying, well, we could use a little more variety. Yeah, we'll take the Ernst seeds and use those.
So if it were my site, right, what I would say is if we're seeing satisfactory regeneration of those kinds of generalist sort of meadow species that you want back into the site, and granted, it can take time for some of the less common stuff to find their way in, I would hold off, right? If instead you're seeing, oh my God, we cleared this area and now it's just a carpet of Arthraxon and we don't know what to do, then I would take them up on the offer for some seed and, then try and work in some other things as that gets established. So if you're finding that you are getting primarily native regeneration, it's reasonable quality stuff, then I would just hold off.
So I have a general question about that in terms of trying to restore a site that was agricultural and, wondering how much native seed bank might be there. Probably not much if it was agricultural for many years. Do you know of any resources or, written materials that talk about that, about trying to convert an agricultural site to a meadow, and what are the most useful ways to go about that? Because there may not be a lot of native seeds. And I think you do have to sort of kill the agricultural grasses for a while, because that's the seed bank, really.
Yes. So I will say I don't know of a lot of great written resources on it. There may be folks here who do. A lot of that knowledge resides in the heads of a lot of different practitioners who, because they're talented practitioners, don't have the time to write anything down because they're busy doing things. I will say that in our experience with sort of reestablishing meadow, and I would absolutely look again at the research that the Clifton Institute is publishing on meadow establishment and management. The Clifton Institute, they're based down in Fauquier in Virginia. They have a few hundred acres that they're working on. So very interesting stuff. There are a lot of different ways to go about it. They are doing burns, they are doing mowing, and they're finding their pluses and minuses to both. In some cases, you will need to suppress sort of things, and chemical controls, sheet mulching, again, depending on the scale of the site, may be usable. I have personally been to restoration sites where they scrape topsoil, and it just makes my skin crawl. I can't deny that what they sowed back in looks nice, but to me, that's I can't make that feel right in my brain. So there are a lot of different ways to go about it. But I would say suppressing, especially turf forming grasses, are going to be the most important component there. Getting in tough native graminoids, grasses, as well as your goldenrods and things like that, and really being on board for a long-term process are going to be the keys to having something good. I know Bradley's been working on getting the meadows here reestablished. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
I'll just put out two other names. Mount Cuba Center has done a lot, especially on their site, of transitioning from previously agricultural land to meadow, as well as Dan Small's group out in Washington College on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. They've been doing a lot of agricultural to prairie grassland type restorations. Dan Small's at Washington College. Yes, they were our main partner for our most recent conference. But yes, as Maddie said, with ongoing meadow, as I was mentioning on the walk, meadows aren't supposed to stay in one place, and just inherently they're so hard to manage. I much prefer the forest.
I have limited space and I would like to add an oak. And I came across a dwarf chinkapin oak at a nursery. I haven't bought one. I'm just wondering, are there questions I should ask about how they made it so dwarf? Or
do you remember the binomial for it? Which species it was?
it was they called it a dwarf chinkapin.
Okay. There's an oak whose binomial escapes me that is naturally a shrub. And I've only seen it in the wild in Fairfax County once, and I think Dominion really wanted to kill it, so I don't know if it's still there. The other thing, if you really have a limited amount of space, is, and we've done this by accident to a couple of oaks in our yard, is just knock them back. And it will start growing kind of multi-stemmed, and it's not all that different from what repeated herbivory is doing to these sorts of things. And honestly, for anyone in this room, and that goes for those of us who are younger than the median age in here, no offense, by the time the oak gets big enough to be a problem, it is not our problem anymore, right? So I would just say, just plant the oak, but yeah.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it is, as Liz was saying too, it is Quercus ilicifolia. That is the scrub oak. That's the shrubby one. Yep. So we're purely, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up our presentation part. Thank you for everyone who attended in person and everyone who joined in online. So yes, thank you all for coming. It is raining now, so please get home safely.